So we just talked about the Civil War, and I'm going to ask a bit of a controversial question, namely that the United States banned slavery far later than in a lot of other places in the whole world,
Right.
Including the UK or the British Empire.
Right.
Why do you think that is, or that was?
So you start to see this trend occur in kind of the mid 1800s, where people start to see slavery as it's tied into social and economic issues in every country where it was practiced, but you start to see this development of it's a moral issue. People might not have necessarily seen African Americans or Africans in general as equal to white people, but they start to realize that they are human, that these are real people with real lives, real wants, real dreams. And so what you start to see is, the UK bans it. Thomas Jefferson bans the importation of slaves to the United States during his administration, but slavery is still practiced within the continental United States up until the 1860s. And where slavery starts to become an issue in the United States is it's not tied just into social and economic positions, but it's tied into political issues as well. By 1860, there were 4 million slaves in the South. Each of those slaves counted as 3/5 of a political vote. And so the more slaves you have, the more votes are available for their masters to use. Well, the Democratic Party started to derive a lot of their power from slave votes, particularly because they were in power in the South. And when Lincoln gets to running in the election of 1860, he's running as a Republican. The Republicans were typically an abolitionist party. They were wanting to ban new states being added to the Union as slave states. And so the Democrats start to see this not just as a social and economic issue, but like, oh my gosh, if Lincoln wins, we could probably no longer add states that are slave states. So our political power comes to a screeching halt. He could ban slavery entirely. He could abolish slavery, which means that, okay, now we have 4 million, divided by 3/5 of the vote. However many votes that is, we no longer have that. So we lose our political power as well. And when you start to see how it's tied into almost every facet of American culture and American economy and politics, that's when people start to become a bit upset. They're like, okay, this is going against the status quo. That's why a lot of states secede. That's why slavery is listed as one of the top political issues, if not the top issue that led to the Civil War, is simply because people didn't, it's kind of like the Cheerios commercial. People fear change. And change was coming, whether they wanted it or not. Lincoln does use the Civil War, however, to great effect, because I think he had his own personal beliefs that slavery inherently was wrong, that it shouldn't exist. And so you see this with the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, part of this is a wartime political maneuver. He wants to alienate the working back of the Confederacy on slaves. He wants to give those slaves a chance to get to the North. The South will be completely destitute as far as working people, because a lot of their labor was based on slavery. However, he goes one step further. By the end of the war, Lincoln is pushing so hard for the 13th Amendment to be passed because he realizes if I don't do this during the war, if I don't go ahead and free all the slaves,
ban slavery,
I'm never going to have a chance to do it afterwards, because people have a sense of complacency. They'll just kind of ease back into that normalcy. And so by the end of the war, Lincoln's having meetings with the Confederacy discussing, terms of surrender. He's meeting with Alexander Stephens secretly. He's also meeting with senators and congressmen saying, what can we do to pass the 13th Amendment? How can I convince you this is the right thing to do?
To ban slavery.
To ban slavery, to abolish it entirely so it won't exist anymore. And by the end of the war, the passage of the 13th Amendment almost did ensure that 4 million people at the end of the war would be free. Once they're brought back into the Union, those states no longer will have slavery.
So to summarize, really, what we're talking about is not only an economic issue, but based on the 3/5 clause of the Constitution, what was really happening was that the abolition of slavery via the 13th Amendment would rob the southern states of vast political power.
It would rob them
political
of vast
representation
political
within
power.
Any sort of unionized structure.
Exactly, but at the same time, whereas they lose their political power and they don't lose their economy. Their economy changes very drastically because you see sharecropping and you start to see almost exclusive black labor and a lot of Southern industrialization after the war. So it's not that the labor system went away; it just changed. And what ends up happening, though, is even though they lose
tenant farming,
sharecropping, pretty much the same thing. You would sign on a contract where you would work, let's say, 70 acres, 100 acres, 150 acres. And somewhere between 50% to nearly 80% of the total profit that you'd make that year went back to the owner that owns the farm. And then the remaining part would go towards your room, your board, your equipment, your livestock.
And that's almost a form of slavery.
Yeah, very much so. But the one main difference in that is that those people could cancel their contracts. They could leave. They could go to something else. Now, they're destitute when they do this, and it leads to a lot of poverty in the South, but especially in African Americans. But what you get is people still have that freedom to move about. They have freedom to make their own choices. And I think that's ultimately the biggest thing that comes out of the Civil War is, one of the U.S. colonels here during this battle famously said Appomattox was a date, it was a place. Franklin was where we knew the war was ending because we could see this clear path leading to the end of the war. We could see a clear path to victory. And one of the things that I draw from that is you think about that from a perspective of one of the slaves who's living here at Franklin at the same time, and they have the same realization he does, except for them, it's not a clear path to just military victory. It's a clear path to freedom. It's a clear path to where they can leave, they can explore their wants and their dreams, they can have families of their own. They don't have to worry about being bought, sold, split up from their families, what have you. Now they get to explore the opportunities that were put in the Declaration of Independence, where all men are created equal. And
black and white.
Black and white. And that's one of the biggest things that comes out of the Civil War is now you really start to see the American dream take off. Because you have this huge migration of people that start to move to the west, to the north, to the south. And they all start exploring different ways of living, different ways of making money. And that's where you really see America take off. Because before that...
About what time period are we talking about?
So we're talking about mid-1860s, right at the end of the war. Probably from 1865 on up until about 1890 is when America just takes off.
Wasn't that also, didn't that also have a backlash in the South with respect to so-called carpetbaggers who would be coming from the North to the South to take advantage of Reconstruction?
It does in some cases, but the thing is when they come to the South, the whole interpretation behind carpetbaggers is these are just people who are looking for different economic opportunities. They would
come from the north to the south.
Yeah, in that void.
You're talking about something that's a little bit different.
Yeah.
You're talking about this freedom of movement from the south to the north.
Correct.
But you also had it the other way.
Correct. So you have a whole population that almost just kind of starts to cycle through different states because you have people who are free now to, let's say, Black Americans are able to go to Chicago, or they're able to go to Texas, or they're able to go to Louisiana, or they're able to go to New York, and they can take advantage of whatever opportunities. With that void of people moving out, there's always a void of new businesses, new industry coming in. So that's where you see a lot of what people call carpetbaggers, Northerners coming south. They're just filling that void. They're just looking for those new business opportunities. One of the best examples is Birmingham, Alabama. Birmingham, before the war, during the war, basically is a couple of houses somewhere on a map. Where it starts to become a power in its own right, they called it the Miracle City, is because they ran a railroad all the way through Atlanta. Birmingham, Alabama had spurs that ran to Atlanta, ran to the coast, ran west into Mississippi, ran north to Tennessee. And Alabama was one of the few places that had all of the natural ingredients required to make pig iron, which was huge in industrial movement. So you start to see these furnaces pop up all over Birmingham. One of the biggest was Sloss furnaces, which had, I believe, 3 foundries, 2 smokestacks, 8 boiler rooms. It was this massive complex. And primarily the workers that they hired were Black workers that post-war weren't going into agriculture, didn't want to go into sharecropping, but they see an opportunity to work in an iron foundry. And that's one of those examples of that's where somebody from the north got the idea to run a rail spur to Birmingham, Alabama, to exploit this, to get the resources there. And they start hiring all these Black workers from the area to work in the furnaces. And so that's where you start to see people from the north taking advantage, or not really taking advantage, probably a poor choice of words.
They're trying to basically search for another industrial revolution.
Exactly, yeah. And you almost see like a second industrial revolution occur in the United States, because that's when the South really starts to industrialize into pig iron, into foundries, into boat building. You start to see, a lot of your great architecture starts to occur post-Civil War instead of pre-Civil War.
Now, one of the things you just talked about that's really interesting that I hadn't considered is that we talked about the Civil War being about freedom of movement.
Yes.
But, when we talk about that, that would put you on the side of the North.
Right.
And so ultimately, the South was almost in a sense fighting for, the maintenance of a lack of the freedom of movement of certain people.
Right.
But at the same time, it sounds like they were also being exploited by the landowners that were affiliated with the banks under this sharecropping system, under this tenant farming system.
Oh, definitely. There's exploitation that goes on even well up into the mid 20th century when you start to see the civil rights movement take place. And it was just there's that void left by slavery. And people didn't have a really good idea of how to fill it. So that's where you get sharecropping. That's where you get, basically the people at Sloss Furnaces, the black laborers that would have worked for.
I apologize for interrupting. When you talk about sharecropping, is that something that only happened after the Civil War?
For the most part, yes. You start to really see it as a phenomenon after the Civil War because you have these...
Did we not have any white farmers that were... Because obviously we had very few landowners everywhere in the world.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm trying to push you on this issue, because it sounds like there had to have been a sort of tenant farming system that would put white farmers to work as well, even though they might have had slaves, as part of that process.
Not really in the same sense. So using the Carter house, here's an example. Fountain Branch Carter has about a 300-acre farm. He and his sons work on the farm, but they also they also have black slaves. And then after the war, they employ a lot of their former slaves to work on the farm. So it's very much the same as it was before and after. The difference is now those slaves, for instance, someone would come to Moscow or come to Fountain Branch, the owners at different times of this farm, and they would say to the Carters, okay, I'd like to collect my time, I'd like to collect my wages, and I'm going to move on. I've got a job working as a logger, in West Tennessee. And so the difference is before the war, the Carters would have said, of course not, I own you, you work here. And then after the war, they have to say, okay, well, here's your time, here's your money, thank you for working here. If you ever need a job, come back again. So it's the sharecropping.
In other words, the landowners during, before the Civil War did not need white labor because they could take advantage of free black labor.
Exactly, yeah.
But most of the economy, even today, all over the world, is still based on agriculture.
Yes.
So what was the white population doing in the South, if not also working in agriculture?
Some of them are working in agriculture, but a lot of times when you have someone like Fountain Branch Carter, he owns this farm, but since he has black labor to manage the farming operations for the most part, then he focuses his attention on other businesses. For instance, Fountain Branch was a land surveyor by trade. He also owned a shoemaking business. At times he invested in a general goods store. Basically most of his time was set more on managing businesses than really working in the business.
And he's a landowner.
Themselves. Exactly.
So I'm talking about just non-landowners, the majority of the population.
So the majority of the population in the South that aren't landowners are either involved in business or they have business interests tied into agriculture. So everybody's profiting off slavery, even if it's just a little bit.
Got it.
Yeah.
That explains it. Thank you so much for your
No
time.
problem. Thank you.